YouTube. Try to do a proper review, not too long, of Knights of the Skull. These are Wayne. This is Wayne Van Zant. Like I said, get anything Wayne Van Zant does. If you have any taste and you like comics, get. And Knights of the Skull it tends to be his work about the most hated evil villains of the entire galaxy, the German army and the National Socialists of the 1930s and 40s. The role models for all your evil villains and empires and Star Wars and all that. Um, this is not. This is basically like it's a comic. It's a history comic. History. So it's not. There's some like narrative, but it's not really a story. It's basically gonna have a lot of words, a lot of talking, and a lot of technical designs. The art is amazing as usual, and like I said, it's late. There's a lot of technical details done to the letter. But you know that you're gonna get that with Van Zant, Wayne Van Zant. I just want to give a shout out to Wayne Van Zant. Very inspired by the late great Sam Glanzman, and another guy inspired by him, Timothy Truman, who I will cover later. These were some of the best artists to me that ever existed in comics, and they're older guys, but so this chronicles the German armored corps, the Panzer, the armored, Panzerkampfwagen, the armored fighting vehicles, mainly the tanks of the German army, and the historical backdrop. You have a little touching thing here. I'll just go a few points. There's something I didn't know here, that the German War Graves Commission is still going all across Europe and Russia, finding German soldiers killed during the Second World War. I didn't even know that was allowed. I didn't even know that still existed. I'm sure it's not a huge thing, but it's very touching that this still exists, and that these men and maybe women are doing this, because so many of the most hated evil soldiers that no one cares about, some of us are related to them by blood, and they were our families. So I think about my an ancestor. I guess he's my third cousin technically, who's lost in Minsk. Young man, never came back, and I have his funeral card in German. He was a Catholic, and my mother read it, and she was in tears reading it. She hadn't seen it probably since she was a little girl. But it's very touching that this is still going on and that people are still doing this. You have the backdrop of the war. You see the British invented the tank. Or you could argue maybe the French invented the tank. I don't know. By the way, the British Tank Corps, if you ever read about it, 1/3 fatalities. A third of these dudes died, not just got injured. And the tank had a huge impact on the Germans. Okay, it really freaked them out, even though they were kind of vulnerable, very flammable, and there was only one hatch, and very thin armor. So a lot of these poor guys died trying to get out of one hatch when they were on fire, which was abominable. I could get into that, what happened to these British guys, but the Germans had their own tank divisions, mostly 2/3 of them made up of these captured tanks. So it shows we got the usual villains over here trying to cause trouble back then. Okay, you have to mention them, and the heroic Freikorps. That's how you stop Bolshevism. That's how you stop communists, red scum. But obviously, this can never be done again. And you have Heinz Guderian, the young man. Let me go through the history of it. Just some interesting notes. The Panzer I, I only had machine guns. This was supposed to be a training tank. But when the war started, this was still mostly what they had, this and the Panzer II. You see these dudes getting chosen for the Panzer Corps. You had to be better than average to get in. You got the cool bitchin' black uniforms, okay? Always the best uniforms, right? And black, always bet on black. And you got interesting panels like this. The horse, the cavalry horse, now put in the rear, and as trucks and tanks take over the role, but still the workhorse of supplies, the former weapon of the aristocracy, now serving the materialist 20th century. It's an anecdote. And every cavalry unit in the armies went through this. They knew they had to mechanize, but you had guys that still wanted the old horse, the elan of the Napoleonic eras and whatnot. Which this war helped to finally put a nail in the coffin of, if not the whole European race. Like I said, I try to separate my emotions from this as much. This is tragedy upon tragedy, seeing men fight each other. European men fight each other. Like we have the invasion of Poland. You see how tough the Poles were. We all know Polish people are pretty tough, right? The invasion of Poland, okay? I'm not going to get into the reasons, but Poles put up a good fight. The Germans were just starting, and they lost a lot of guys. There were friendly fire incidents. And this, like, scenes like this, they show where the Panzers run into tougher tanks. These are licensed Vickers tanks that the Poles bought. They put a whooping on the Germans. Better cannons. You had these didn't even have cannons. And you had like two of them take out like a bunch of German tanks. And you had the cool Czech tanks. Czechoslovakia had better tanks than what the Germans had made. But when they took over Czechoslovakia, they took these tanks. And they were very good tanks up until probably the middle of the war, just because they started to get outdated due to just armor and guns. Anyway, then they tangled with the French, who had really massive, monstrous tanks, heavily armored and weaponed. And you see stuff like this when the Germans in the Battle of France, which my grandfather was in. He was under Erich von Manstein. He has those cool Czech 35Ts, which were actually excellent tanks. I'll bring it up again just because it's a very underrated tank. And it showed the French fought, and the French tanks were better. You had an episode like this, where a bunch of German tanks, the Panzerjägers, the tank hunters using the guns, could not penetrate the armor, okay? And you had a couple of these put a real hurting on the Panzers. You had like one of these knock out 8 German tanks. You had these guys in ambush wipe out a whole bunch of German tanks. The problem was armor and guns. But the Germans had something the French didn't have, and which the Soviets didn't have: radios. So they were able to coordinate attacks. So you could have these maybe inferior tanks, armored-wise and weapon-wise, swarm on tanks like this using coordinated attacks and flanking. Okay, you're looking at the tank here as a fortress, whereas the Germans were looking at the tanks as cavalry, like as something out of the Confederate cavalry in the Civil War, which the Prussians and the Germans had studied extensively, by the way. But the French tried, man. I mean, you know, I hate that reputation of the French. Oh, they're cowardly. Are you kidding? You must be joking. My grandfather always liked the French, and he spoke French, my grandfather. So, and he always thought well of the French people and the Russian people. So much for an evil Nazi, white supremacist taking over the world concept, right, guys? I thought this was funny. The 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, and this was funny. Friendly fire, and he was yelling at them and gave them champagne. But it didn't get funny when the British Matildas came in, the BEF. Now, this is the first time the British are fighting, and unfortunately, some of them knocked out some French tanks. Well, you know, the British and the French always get along, yeah? And you got the Mark I Matilda with just a machine gun. Germans could not penetrate their armor until they took the 88 anti-aircraft gun and just lowered it, and then that was it for the Matildas. There's the cool armored cars with the 8 wheels. Anyway, this is part 1. This is the German war in the East, the West, the Blitzkrieg, historical comic, and I'm going to get into. I'm not a huge superhero fan. Okay, it's pretty clear. I like history. I like kind of stuff like that. I like science fiction, horror, superheroes. Have a troublesome genesis. If you understand the genesis of these superhero comics, if you look at who and what created these superhero comics, the whole idea of a superhero is that it's someone that you can't be unless you have a special power. Okay, whereas the heroes of the past were usually just men who were just masculine, who were within the realm of possibility, maybe helped by the gods, or even maybe part gods, but always still very vulnerable. And the superhero comics have a troublesome thing. It separates you, the reader, from actually being possibly a hero. Obviously, tons of guys went through this. My grandfather was in this. I just hate all these. Can you imagine if we had all these men now united? Europe would be safe. America, I can't speak for, but Europe and the European races of people would be safe. But anyway, there's no use beating that dead horse, is it? Now, my thing too with comics is that comics have a capacity not just for fantasy, obviously metaphors and all that, but this is useful to teach. If I have grandchildren, they could read this years after I'm dead. If I keep this good, and they can read what happened in an objective sense, which Wayne Van Zant, who's an older man, is still able to do. When he passes away, it's going to be a very sad time because there's not going to be a lot of people trying to cover the actual history of this in a relatively objective manner. So I see comics, even fantasy comics or science fiction or horror, can be something like, Edgar Allan Poe or John Carter or what have you. Tarzan can teach young men, young boys, qualities of how to be, and also historically to see what happened before, rather than watching a bunch of people running around in tights, as thinly veiled analogies for, the other, the plucky other the other who rules everything. While the guy who actually funds it and buys the stuff and enjoyed it is slowly edged out. You're not going to have that with this. Knights of the Skull, Blitzkrieg. I'm going to cover the next one, which is obviously going to be, Barbarossa. Anyway, get anything from Wayne Van Zant that you can. This is good stuff. And he just doesn't do Germans. He does every kind of country, what they went through. He has a whole graphic novel series coming out of the Eastern Front from the Russian, particularly the Ukrainian perspective. And I can't wait to get my hands on that and review it for you. Okay, later.